The light looks great. Yeah, that's terrific. Um, could we ask you to start by just telling us how you got into this mess? How did you find yourself being a B-17 pilot? And anyway,
Well, I finished college at Kansas State College in 1941, and my last semester I took the CPT course, Civilian Pilot Training course, and of course we'd already registered for a draft, and I then tried to get in to the Navy or the Air Corps when my number was coming up. Been too hard on my eyes last in college and then when I went to work. And so I got drafted. I was drafted on the first day of December 1941. So I was at Fort Leavenworth when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And let me say this, that 1 week was the most fouled up organization I'd ever been around, because some people were getting out, some of us were coming in, others wondered how long and so on. But the day after Pearl Harbor, and we gathered as a group, it was an entirely different story. The Japanese put this country on a war footing and determination. We met the next day after Pearl Harbor, and the attitude is, hey, we've got a war to fight, let's get at it and get it over with so we can go home. And so after being in for a little while, almost 6 months, in which I had been offered the opportunity to go to OCS in infantry, which didn't appeal, I ended up in the veterinary corps and medical, and I was offered the opportunity to go to administrative course in the hospital setup. And neither one of these appealed to me, and I stalled. Then I went and took my exams, and I was able to pass, and I got transferred to the Air Corps. And so then I went through my cadet training and got my wings at Aldous, Oklahoma in June of 1943. Immediately was sent to Pio, Texas as a co-pilot on a B-17, and that's where our crew was put together as a training crew. The first pilot had gone through transition school, been there a couple of months flying B-17, and then we transferred from one phase to another, and then in November was sent to England. And I always joke about the fact that I had a fancy ride on the Queen Elizabeth to England. I had a stateroom. I just had to share it with 21 other officers. And so then we, in England, then we were assigned to our bases, and I was assigned to the 358th Squadron of the 303rd Bomb Group. And from there, that's where things proceeded. And it had some previous missions, but the one that really got me into hot water was on the 11th of January in 1944. And that was to be a maximum effort. And our group, the 303rd Bomb Group, was leading the 41st Wing, and the 41st Wing was leading the 8th Air Force, or the 1st Division of the Air Force that day. And in the lead air crew was General Travis, for whom Travis Air Force Base is named. Well, anyway, we were supposed to have fighter cover, and it ended up we had very little because the mission was actually recalled. Each division had a different target. Our division was assigned Oschersleben, Germany. Another one went to Halberstadt, and another division went to Brunswick. And it was a maximum effort to destroy airplane building and aircraft. And since we were already under attack when the mission was recalled, the lead groups on those targets all went. And we had 2.5 hours of solid fighter attack. with very little protection from the fighters because they were getting weathered in. And we did our bomb run when we were on our way back. We lost 2 engines on the way in, but still able to get to the target. And as we came off the target, we cut some corners to stay within the group possible, and then decided that with 2 engines we couldn't keep up with the formation. But so we decided to toss off a little altitude for speed and stay under the formation. And that's what we did. And we were getting along all right, even with 2 engines out. The 2 we had left were the outboard ones, so that was best. And we had 15,000 feet of altitude and, as we were approaching the Holland, and figured that, hey, we would make it, when we would have, except we had a fighter make another pass at us, and he set our number 2 gas tank on fire. That's not a very healthy situation. So the pilot ordered bailout, and I looked out, and we were flying above clouds, and I looked at the altimeter, I reviewed the tops of the clouds, and I decided that I would go into the clouds before I pulled my parachute. But anybody that's saving salvation for me was that I listened to a British paratrooper just a few days before, and he let us understand that as you go out of an airplane, you're going to roll like a ball. If you stretch your arms and legs out stiff, you quit that, and then you're in control. That's how I followed through, and when I decided I'll go into clouds before I pull my ripcord, which I did. And when I pulled my ripcord, I immediately popped out below, and I only had about 500 feet. And all I could see was water. And then I finally spotted a little strip of land between 2 bodies of water, which turned out to be the Zuider Zee was the big one, and the smaller body was the Kingsmere Lake, which is just at the adjoining northeast corner of Amsterdam. So here again, if I just let it ride, I was going in the drink. And I remembered what the paratrooper said when I spotted that land. He said, if you will pull the shroud lines down in the direction you want to go. And that's what I did. And that strip of land's only about 30 or 40 yards wide. My first parachute jump, and it absolutely was perfect. I hit it. So that's how I started out.
That's how you got into this. Okay.
Scoot the mic down just a tad.
Okay.
A little bit hot.
That's wonderful. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to hear this through the ears of cadets now, and not knowing for sure where within the 4 years they might see this. May I ask you just a couple of things
Sure.
about that too? Maximum effort. Could you tell us a little, what does that mean exactly?
Well, a maximum effort, we were to put up every available plane from a base. And so we were really scheduled to have at least 600 planes up that day from the 8th Air Force. We ended up with about 300.
Okay. And you mentioned that your mission was recalled. Why would they recall a mission?
Well, the weather moved in while we were there on this mission. The weather moved in, and they knew we'd have trouble getting back to the bases, and they knew that the fighters would have trouble getting off and protecting us. So they recalled the mission, but nobody's going to turn back when you're already under attack.
Okay.
So that's why we went. And
okay. And for something like 2.5 hours, you were under fighter attack. How did you feel as you were? What did you see? What did you experience?
I guess well, you were constantly, those machine guns were rattling all the time. And I have our records from the 303rd Bomb Group. No other day did our bomb group expend such huge quantities of ammunition. They kept track of that, and that was enormous. And one of the things, the fighters came in real close, and that was the first time they they had fired rockets, and the Ju-88s lined up out at the edge and lobbed rockets into our formation. Those didn't turn out to be too much problem, except disturbing to the formation, because the men could spot them and you could move around and avoid. But I guess the most disheartening thing was that I saw so many airplanes blow up that day because of the closeness that they were coming in and so forth. And in the final analysis, our bomb group, well, we lost 11 crews. And that's pretty heavy out of something less than 60 bombers up. And the lucky side is that for me is that when I came back, of course, I got a chance to go out to my base, and no one else had come back. And when the war was over, it turns out that of the 109 of us missing in action that day from my base, 46 were reported as killed in action, and 62 ended up as prisoners of war. I was the only one out of the 109 that came back, and so I felt pretty lucky.
How many missions had you flown before this?
That was my third mission. Actually, it was my fourth, I guess, but one of them was an air-sea rescue mission, in which we didn't find anybody, but spent a day flying over the North Sea.
Had you encountered this kind of flak and fighter attack before?
No, nothing like that. We'd had flak, and we got our usual amount of flak. But for the fighters to come in so close, you see, one of the things that made it difficult for us was we flew this as a feint raid on Berlin. The mission was flown as a dead beat to Berlin, and then turned off to the right, and then at the IP turned onto the target. But the fighters didn't know that we weren't going for Berlin, and up to that point we had never been to Berlin in daytime. And so that's one of the things that brought it up.
One of the things young people often worry about is how they'll respond in combat. Will they be able to go ahead and do their job, will they panic or be frightened and so forth? 2.5 hours this went on for you. How frightened were you?
Well, I think anybody that goes through something like that and says they're not afraid is a darn liar. But the thing that you have to remember about fear is don't let it consume you. Keep your wits about you. You got a job to do, and do your job. Now, unfortunately, when I went down to the front hatch to go out, when I bailed out, our bombardier was still sitting in the nose. And so after all that attack, my first question was to go to him and ask him if he was all right or if he had been shot. And he said, "No, I'm all right." And I said, "You should have been gone." And he said, "I'll follow you." And I didn't realize that I was looking at a man which was frozen with fear. And when he jumped, he never pulled his ripcord. The Dutch people found the body and reported that to me. So I guess that's where fear, if fear consumes you and takes over, you're out of control.
Did you experience any physical effects of fear? Did you find yourself shaking or perspiring, or could you tell you were?
Well, I guess you always have a little bit of that. We wore heated flight suits, and I learned very early on my first mission that heated flight suit, you don't need it in the pilot seat or co-pilot seat until after the fight's over. And then you're perspiring. And so you turn it on to dry out. And so that's kind of the key to it.
Back to the training, too. You say you benefited from an RAF crew member who told you about the experience of bailing out and so forth.
Right.
Do you recall any other training that was especially useful to you? Did they tell you what to do if you find yourself on the ground?
Well, of course, we had some briefings, and one of the key factors with most of the people who came back was if possible, they made delayed jumps, so they were not visible in the air too long.
Why was that?
And so this is why I had decided to delay my parachute opening.
Why did you do that? Why did you want to delay it?
Well, I didn't want to be in the air too long. Yeah, there were not too many, but a number of men ended up with bullet holes in their parachutes and so forth. You never knew. After all, I might have been a real good German pilot, and I might have decided, hey, I'm not going to shoot at that guy, but then I may have just seen them bomb my hometown or something, you know. So you never know what the reaction is going to be. So the less time you're dangling out there, the better.
Okay. As you were getting those briefings about how to bail out and so forth, did it seem to you that you really might do that kind of thing, or did it just seem a distant?
No, it always seemed as a possibility. And in fact, my older brother was a Navy pilot, and he visited me as I was preparing to leave for overseas. And I had told him at that time, I said, Floyd, if I'm ever reported missing in action, tell the folks that I expect to come back. And this is part of it, the psychology. You don't win if you don't think you can win. And so I had made up my mind that, hey, if I went down, I was going to do everything I could to get out and work in that direction.
And 109 of you went down that same day?
From my base.
Yeah, from your base.
Oh.
Okay, let's see. We've got you on the ground now. We've got NATO studies showing that about 60% of everybody who bails out is injured by the time they get to the ground. And about 100% are injured before they ever are recovered. What was your physical condition when you hit the ground?
Well, I was very lucky. The only thing I had done, I went out of the airplane in exactly the same fashion I always went out on the ground. Put my legs down through the escape hatch, reached across, and got a hold, and then swung out. Now, that's the way I did it on the ground. Well, the only thing that happened out of that was that when I reached across and in swinging out, I cut a hand on the airplane. And so that's the only ill effect I had. And I was very fortunate, so many people not being accustomed to jumping. And I guess really, when you compare to the paratrooper, we were jumping with pretty small chutes. And so we hit a little harder. And I was fortunate that the spot where I came down was grass. And I hit and had no problem. And of course, they told you to get rid of your parachute and so forth. And so I looked around and, hey, where am I going to bury a parachute there between two bodies of water and grass? And so I decided I'll throw them in the water. And so I threw them into the lake, and the parachute harness and the Mae West, and they weren't sinking, and the parachute. And so I had worn heavy flight boots over GI shoes that day instead of heated shoes. And so I took off my flight boots and filled them with water and chucked them in on top of my parachute and so forth, and they sunk. And so, and even though I told people where those were, to this day, nobody has knowledge that those were ever found.
You suck them well.
Right.
Hidden the sharks.
I think you're the first person we've talked with who didn't have the electric things on inside the boots. How did you happen to have GI shoes instead?
Well, the reason I did is we were flying at 25,000 feet, and I didn't figure it was going to be cold enough to force it, and so I wore GI shoes.
Had you done that on the previous missions too?
In one of my missions, I wore the heated shoes, and here again, it's one of those things that I found out that I needed a heated suit to dry me out after the fight.
Do you remember any any briefings about in which people told you to carry your GI shoes but tie them to your parachute harness or?
Oh,
like
I
that?
had heard those things, but then I had also learned very quickly that that wasn't the securest thing in the way to hang. Most secure method of hanging on to your shoes.
Everybody says they lost them. They came off anyway, yeah. I wonder about what kind of equipment, AIDS kit or survival kit? Did you have any kind of survival kit with you?
Yes, I had the standard survival kit and had it zipped into the pocket of my summer flight suit that I had on over the top of my heated suit. And of course, when you land and you land in a situation like I did, the first question is, where do I go? And I happened to have been extremely lucky. I could only go 2 directions. And somebody came riding a bicycle down a path and against that dike, and they saw me and they pointed, and I went that direction. If I had gone the other direction, I'd walked right into a little village and been arrested. So I had, he solved my 50-50 choice. And so I ran about a quarter of a mile and I reached the end of the lake and then went out of the field and hid. And as I did so, the first thought, and I don't know how this would be, but probably with many people, once I was on the ground, hey, I knew I was all right, and I was hidden and so hiding in the water. And the thought came to my mind, now I know I'm safe, but my parents are going to get the letter, the telegram, which says your son is missing in action, and they won't know. And of course they didn't know for several months. That's one of the tough things.
One of the first things you thought about.
Yeah, and of course today, communications and so forth, those things go much faster, but back then, that was
Now, you
different.
say you knew you were safe. Was there any inclination toward panic at all when you found yourself on the ground?
No, and I had concluded very quickly that I would hide, and I had this summer flight suit on, which was green, and thank goodness in Holland they have little ditches to drain the water off so they can graze in between. And I laid right down in one of those ditches, and in a little water, which wasn't too warm on the 11th day of January. And I had concluded in my own mind, I'll stay here until it's dark enough that I feel it's safe to move. But before it got that dark, people who had seen me land from a farmhouse, one of them came out.
How well did you know where you were when you hit the ground?
I didn't.
Okay. Did you have any plan in mind? It's a long way from the Zuider Zee to the Pyrenees.
Well, no, I didn't have any plan in mind. You gotta, you're hoping you can get some help.
Okay. You figured you were going to have to count on help eventually.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Any other crew members? Did you encounter them anytime soon?
No.
Okay.
No.
Please tell us what you did next. Then you've sunk your boots and part of your uniform, May West, I guess.
Yeah.
And tell us what happened next.
Well, then I, with the man pointing, I ran in that direction till I got out in the field and they done. And before I thought it was dark enough to move, an individual who had seen me out there came out and from the farmhouse and got reasonably close and began a low whistle. But he still couldn't see me. And so when he kind of looked in my direction, I popped my head up a bit, and then he came over. And his question was, American? I said, yes. Well, he just made a motion for me to stay put. And so then he went back and checked things out around the farmhouse again, and then came back out for me to follow him to the farmhouse. So I immediately got some help in getting in. Now, of course, that could have been bad. I didn't know then, and didn't know until recent years, that that man had a brother who had volunteered for the German army. But he took me to the house, and in the house, you entered it through where they were milking cows, and a couple of young ladies were in there milking cows. They walked in behind the cows and into the kitchen, and then they had a man there that spoke excellent English, and so he attempted to interrogate me. I knew that I was being interrogated by a professional interrogator, but it only been in recent years that I learned that that man was a German. He worked for the Rotor News Service, and he was stationed in Holland. He had become friendly with the Dutch people, and even though they even had him in prison at one time, they realized that he was on their side. And so I was interrogated by a reporter, a professional.
What kind of instruction or training had you received about how to deal with that situation, about how to deal with interrogation?
Well, strictly name, rank, and serial number. That was it. And this man, he interrogated me for quite some period of time, tried to, and much of it was trying to convince me to surrender, and telling me that they were getting Red Cross packages into the prisons and it wouldn't be too long and all that kind of stuff. And after this went on for quite some time, and some of my clothes were in the oven trying to get dried out. And so I, after a period of time, I just finally got up and I said, look, if you're not going to help me, don't hinder me. I have no intention of surrendering. That, of course, was the positive response that he was looking for.
How would you describe the way you talked with him during the interrogation? What was your attitude toward him?
Well, I was not combative, but I was not giving out any unnecessary information, and I let him know that I was seeking help.
Had you received any training about how to tell which people to deal with, which people to approach?
Well, the only training we had along that line was they told us not to go to the big houses. Those were often occupied by Germans, and that turned out to happen to us in France. And to try to approach people, if possible, your first contacts, do it where you're on a one-on-one and not outnumbered. Well, of course, they came out on a single basis and got me.
One of the things that I think we'll get to later, because I know you were interrogated again, too, and we'll be talking, of course, with Yvonne tomorrow. Some of the helpers had checklists of questions to ask so they could authenticate your identity. How did you know when it was safe to tell these kinds of things about your unit?
Well, I got from this farm. They hid me out for the night. They had to protect themselves, and that night they hid me out in a cowshed, and got me the next morning. And then I ended up finally in Amsterdam, where I stayed for 17 days in a safe house, and then I was escorted from Amsterdam to Venlo. Well, by this time, when you spent this much time in an organization, you begin to feel that, hey, wait a minute, here are people really laying their lives on the line. And they'd been taking care of me, feeding me. I'd already been given civilian clothing, and so on. So at some point, you have to start trusting. Okay. And so it was actually in Venlo before I received another interrogation. And there, one of the things that happened to me, I had never been on a train in Europe, and I didn't realize that they didn't take up the tickets till you got off and this kind of stuff. A lot of mistakes I made, but turned out all right. I had a fake passport, naturally. But when I got off the train at night in Venlo, and I thought the man would be checking passports, I didn't realize he would be taking up tickets. I got within 12 feet of this German soldier, and I realized that he was collecting tickets. Too late to go fishing in my pockets for a ticket at that point. And I had this fake passport in my hand expecting to show it. So I just used a brazen approach and flashed that in his face and walked on by. I guess they had so many people, Germans, riding on passes and so on, that he thought I was one of them. It worked. But that night, that was it was late evening, and that was then when I was interrogated in Venlo. And I was interrogated by the lady who next day took me to Maastricht.
Okay. Well, I'll come back to that. Would you like a
Yes.
drink of water?
Good thing, if he thought you were German, he didn't start talking to you in German.
He was a deaf mute. He was a butcher, so he couldn't have answered anyway.
Okay.
Back there to the time you find yourself beside the water before you were taken in. Did you ever experience one of the things many aviators mention as being very, very cold, or in the Pacific very hot, but did you ever experience severe cold?
Well, when I experienced severe cold when I was in the water, prone in about 2 inches of water. There I got cold.
This was in mid-January.
And you know, it's an interesting thing. I could visualize myself coming down with severe cold and so on. I never did catch cold.
Never did experience illness, did you, of any kind? Okay. How did the cold affect you? What do you remember about that experience?
Well, the first night was pretty cold in the cowshed, and my shoes, our leather shoes don't turn water when you're walking in a couple of inches like those wooden shoes do, and so my shoes were pretty wet. And my feet were wet. I couldn't get them dried up, and so I couldn't tolerate those cold feet. And so I was in this cowshed, and I laid down in a manger and covered it up with some hay. And being an old farm boy, I didn't mind cattle. And a big heifer laid down over there close to the close, and so I just took my shoes off and put them underneath of her, and got warm. That helped me.
Were you ever severely thirsty or hungry?
No, not really. No, I usually managed to have enough food. People brought me food that was there. One time, I'm sure I got a piece of meat that was almost a man's week's ration.
Do you remember ever finding it difficult to sleep or get enough rest? Was fatigue a problem?
No, I didn't really suffer from fatigue. I'm not a type A individual, and so if I get a chance to relax, I can go sleep.
Okay. How about when you went over the Pyrenees?
No, that got a little tougher. And now this is one, I gave everything away out of my escape kit to the Dutch people very early, because those can be a signal to get away. And one of the things that I wanted to keep was my GI watch. And I was wearing shorts that you tied to get the right side. And so I took that watch off and tied it on my shorts and got it out. But the other thing I kept out of my escape kit was my Benzarine pills, my pep pills. And there were 2 of them, and I kept those all the time. And when we got ready, and when we were going over the Pyrenees Mountains, we were 3 days and nights because we had to start back just outside of the forbidden territory. And so it took us a couple of nights to get through the forbidden territory and get up to where we started climbing the mountains. And but the last night was the toughest. And there were 4 of us. Kenneth Shaver and I had been together since we'd left Paris. And then there was a French courier, and he had been dropped in with money or instructions and so forth. He was on his 3rd trip, and he was going back out. And then the 4th person joined us at our initial starting point, and he was a Spaniard who had skipped Spain during the Spanish Civil War and been living in France and wanted to go home. And there was an exchange between him and the guide, I think, that made that possible. But anyhow, our last night, and this was the middle of April, and we were waist deep in snow. And we were above the clouds and struggling to get to the top of the mountains to start down into Spain. And we stopped for a rest. And the Spaniard said, not going on. He was completely out of it, said he couldn't make it. So at that point, I couldn't see leaving him in the mountainside. That would really hurt. And so I took one of these benzoline pills, and with snow melting some water, I gave him one of them. And then Ken Shaver and I split the other one. And and this was a trying thing. And then after a while, we got him up, and we got him over. We didn't leave him out there. But there were only half of us that got as far as the foothills of the Pyrenees that got through and into Spain. And many were recaptured, and there were fights, people drowned, all kinds of things happened. But many of them just physically gave up, and so they were usually recaptured.
Could you?
That's right.
You got there, yeah.
You kept your maps too, remember?
Just let me make sure he's refocused.
Mhm.
Okay.
We all right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Before I leave the tablet, you took a half a tablet. Could you tell any effect on yourself from that?
Yes. Yes, it was helpful.
What did you experience?
You just kind of got a boost out of it.
Boost of energy and
Yes,
Mhm.
yes, a boost of energy.
Alertness, yeah. Okay. Okay. Back. I keep taking you back and forth. I apologize.
That's all right.
Back to the town where you received your second interrogation.
Yes,
Could you tell?
that's Venlo, Holland.
Okay. Could you explain that to us? What did they ask?
Okay, Yoka came in and she had a list, and she name and identification and such as that, and as I recall, they were not real too inquisitive about our targets and some of those things, but they did want to know as much as anything where we were from and kind of get some background for identification.
Did you feel they were asking these things to authenticate your identity, or rather just to be sure they had accurate records of who?
No, I felt it was to verify my identity, because they were being infiltrated all the time, or attempted to be infiltrated all the time.
Okay. When did you first begin wearing civilian clothes, and how did you get?
Well, the next day after being in the shed overnight, I was put in a house out on an island in the lake for the next day. And when I came in at night, they came and got me at night by boat and headed into Amsterdam. Okay, they needed me to cover up my clothes, and so they picked the Mackinac off of that had been hanging in the barn, and I put that on. Well, anybody that approached me, boy, that's an old farm boy. They could tell that. Anyhow, but then after I got into Amsterdam, I spent one night with a barber who and his wife would come after me, and then I went to a safe house where a lady kept me for 17 days. And at that point, is where they brought me new clothes, good clothes. And I ended up being fairly well dressed. They also gave me dyes to dye my shoes black. So I was able to hang on to and wear my GI shoes.
Did you have any reluctance at all to wear civilian clothes? There were.
No, I really didn't. I kept my dog tags on.
Okay. Why did you do that?
Well, I didn't want to give my dog tags up. I kept those around my neck all the time. And it's as good a time to tell you about it as any, but I ended up with this Ken Shaver, and Ken Shaver had been down since November. And we got together first in the edge of Belgium, and then in Paris we were almost captured, and he and I took off alone. And I knew he didn't have his dog tags. Ken had his dog tags in his leather jacket, and they had been captured. They crash landed, and his surviving crew members had been captured. And they jumped off, beat up the Germans and guards, and jumped off a train. And so they had been hid out for quite some time. And his dog tags were in the jacket which he left on the train. And so we figured that was, we felt vulnerable all the time, the fact that he didn't have any dog tags. And he was in civilian clothing. And when we got to Spain, and the next day when I called and reported in the embassy, they called back in a little while and they said, well, you check out all right, but how long have you known Sergeant Shaver? Where did you meet him, and so forth? And I'd filled them in. And I said, why all the questions? They said, you check out all right, but according to the Red Cross, he's dead. And so never knew much about that. We spent time together later, but after in the States. But come to find out that he was reported dead, and when we got home, his wife took him out and showed him his grave and all. But not until I'd written a book, and Mr. Watts, who crashed in Belgium, read the book, he always wondered why the missing aircrew report showed that Kenneth Shaver was killed on his plane. And he went down in 1944, a month later. And what had happened, he knew his bombardier had been killed. His ball turret man had been killed. And couldn't figure out why this was until he read my book. And then realized that the Germans had Shaver's dog tags, but those were old as far as the underground would be concerned, and they wanted current ones. So they took the dog tags off of the man that was killed in Watts's plane and replaced them with Shaver's. So they had current dog tags for infiltrating.
The concern about wearing civilian clothes, some people have voiced it, has been that once you start doing that, you could be you lose some of your privileges under the Geneva Convention. If you're caught in civilian clothes, you could be shot as a spy, but you didn't worry about that.
I didn't worry about that.
Was there a time when you knew for sure that you were no longer just being helped by friendly Dutchmen, but that you were in the hands of the underground?
Well, I realized that by the time I got to Venlo. I realized that.
Okay.
And because things were falling in place.
Okay. Would you just take us along your route of travel? Incredible trip you had then. How did you go from there to eventually to Belgium and then to...
Well, I was taking, we had a train, of course, from Amsterdam to Venlo through Eindhoven. And then after interrogating me in the evening in this home at our safe house where I'd spent the night, Yoko Fulmer had told me she'd be back the next day and get me. And she came back in the afternoon, and she did get me and took me to the railroad station in Venlo, and we rode the train then to Maastricht. And and this was one of the things that was very nice. She spoke good English. She was Dutch, but she had spent much of her life in the Dutch Indies and so forth. She was back, and she was, I think she was only 19 or something at that time, and we could travel so comfortable on the train. And when we got to Maastricht, we got off, and there we met Jacques Free, and with him was a fellow by the name of Smits, and they were taking care of people in the Maastricht area. Well, the one thing that was really kind of interesting is, as we were in the Maastricht train station, here was our first introduction, my first introduction to the German youth, and they had had this group of German youth in the railroad station, and a German troop train came by, and their purpose was to play the band and so forth for the troop train, and then I spent about 2 weeks in the safe house in Maastricht, and incidentally, people don't realize how great the sacrifice was. The man, for example, that took me from Amsterdam to Venlo, he was later captured and apparently executed on the spot. No trial or anything. Yoko was captured later. They never knew for everything. She survived. But in the final analysis, for every one of us that got out of Holland, the people of Holland paid with 3 lives. And in Maastricht is when I met Jacques, and I stayed in a butcher shop, over a butcher shop, which was their home, and could look out on the street and so forth. And that butcher got the greatest kick out of the fact that for something to do, he had to send coupons that he collected for beef. He had to send them in. And so I spent a day helping him put those in. He thought that was the greatest thing, to have an American sitting in his living room putting the coupons in the books to send to Hitler. But later on, both he and his brother were arrested, and they both died in separate prison camps. But a man came back, and it was not Jacques Fry, but Smits came back one day and afternoon and got me and took me to a location in Amsterdam where I was met by a young girl with a bicycle. And she was a small girl. And
You weren't in Amsterdam, you were in Maastricht.
and Maastricht. Yeah, it was in Maastricht. And she took me out to the, and she put me on a bicycle. And that was one of the, I guess, foolish feelings I had, was here I was a man being ridden on the handlebars with a little girl riding me out there, but nothing else to do. She knew where we were going. There was only one bicycle. She got me out close to the, right to the border, and it was night, and hid the bicycle in a little garage, and she kind of fraternized with the guards because she worked in Holland and lived in Belgium, was back and forth, and so she had it set up. But what I would do is I would slide behind a privet hedge and to cross the border while she was talking to the German guard, and then on the other side she came back and got me and hid me in a house for a while she went back and got a couple more.
You had false identity papers at
Yes.
the time? Why did she not want you to encounter the guard?
It just wasn't necessary to make that. If she could get me by without using them, she didn't want to.
Okay. Were you worried about being caught sneaking around the hedge?
Hey, it's all a risk, but what's the alternative? I figured I had less risk than she did.
Okay.
And so but the interesting thing was there, she had a safe house where she could leave me for a few hours, and it was a short few hours. The lady in that house had 4 brothers in the German army.
But she was a support her, a helper.
Right,
nonetheless.
but she was willing to help. But very nervous about it all.
Before we leave the false identity, could you tell us what kind of false identity papers you had and how did you get them?
Well, the Dutch people made them, and they used the pictures that I had. I had 2 pictures in my escape kit, and they used one of them to make an identity paper in Holland.
What all papers did you had? A passport?
All it was just an identity card, and that would permit you. And I was usually deaf and dumb doing something. And now, when we got to Brussels, and incidentally we stayed just across the border into Belgium one night, and this was the lady's home, girl's home. Her father was very active in the underground, and I think she needed money. There were 3 girls, which taking the next day 6 of us into Brussels, and we went first by tram and then by train. And she needed money for tickets, and so another man and I, they had 2 men, an Englishman and an American, spent the night in the house, and out in the back were 3 other men, which included Ken Shaver. But anyway, her dad went and picked up an attaché case and brought it in, and it was filled with money. And he gave her money then to buy tickets. And I don't know anything about that money except he laughed and he said, "'Tis all good, we just made it." And I never knew. But of course, we dropped the money to help.
Okay. And then you went to Brussels.
Yes.
What happened?
We entered Brussels at La Gare Nord, the North Station, and the 6 of us, and they were taking us to a restaurant. And this was on a Sunday, and we spent much of the day in this restaurant. And that was my first experience with the universal restrooms. When I had to go, and that was kind of embarrassing to walk into a restroom. It just had water closet, and it worked. And we spent the day there, and then that evening, a man came, late afternoon, a man came to get us, the 6 of us, and take us to a safe house across town in Brussels. And I've never been able to locate that. I've been back many times. I've located most things. The restaurant where we were, that was closed and destroyed, but I've been through La Gare Nord. And, but anyhow, this man spoke excellent English, and he met the 6 of us, and we were getting on a streetcar. It was night. The streetcar was completely full, and he shoved the 6 of us up into the onto the stoops and so forth of this streetcar, and handed the conductor money, and in plain English says, "Give me 7 of the best." And I don't know the connections and so forth, but I do know he was so far out on the step that his rear end knocked off and broke one of the lights on the safety zone. But he took us across town and put us into another safe house, and I spent, I guess, a week or so there before we moved on to Paris.
How did you get to Paris then?
The same man took us 4 at a time. Since there were 8 of us, he took us 4 at a time to Paris. And I went with the second group. And the first group had a real experience, and Ken Shaver was in that group. When they went to the train station to take the train was way late because the tracks had been bombed coming out of Berlin and so on. And they almost Well, they got to the French, they had difficulty finding a place on the train, and when they got to the border, they did the same thing with them that they did with us. And then I had a new ID card by this time, but they took us off, and we went through the customs office and got back on. I haven't encountered other people that did that, but they that's what they did. And anyhow, when he took the first group through, rather than have a risk that they would be identified with civilians, he found, while they were stopped at the customs, he found a German troop train that had plenty of room on it. And he took these 4 fellows in and cussed out the Germans in German for taking up so much room, and set the Americans down among the Germans. He knew they wouldn't please them, and so. But they did want us to have new ID cards, because there was a problem, really, that most of us ended up wearing the same coat and so forth when the pictures were made for IDs. And so when we were in Brussels, a man took us 2 at a time and took another fellow with me. And this was the same time Rommel had come back from North Africa, and he was parading the streets of Brussels and so on. But this guy took us downtown on the streetcar. We went into a department store and used a machine that had pictures made, and then new IDs.
In your original false ID, you were a Dutch citizen?
Yeah.
Did you become a Belgian citizen?
I don't. Yes, I would had to have become a Belgian citizen, but I was a deaf and dumb baker working in France. And to add to that, they gave us a few items to put into a little briefcase to carry, and that's what we had when we went through the customs office and all.
I was wondering, yeah, you were, originally you were a Dutch butcher, I think you said.
Well,
Definite butcher, yeah. I would suppose if a butcher were caught, a Dutch butcher were caught in Belgium, that in itself would be terribly suspicious. What's a butcher from?
Yeah, whatever it
from
was,
Belgium
it would,
to Belgium?
from Holland, it would be suspicious, right?
Now, were all of your acquaintances deaf-mute? Were they?
I think most of us ended up that way. And you know, that was a ridiculous thing, but it did keep people, if they tried to talk to you, you had an excuse. But there was another feature why it would work. And that is, able-bodied people were already confiscated by the Germans. So you had to have had some impairment not to be.
Did any official ever challenge you, ever say anything to you? You never had to do more than just flash the thing.
Now, they looked at them fairly good as we went through the customs office, going from Belgium into France. But the people may have had a connection there. I don't know. The underground may have had.
No one ever questioned you, though? No German official ever questioned
No.
you? Okay. Communication with the underground and with others. Did you speak any language other than English when you were
No.
shut down? Had you received any training in any phrases that would be useful to
No.
Nothing at all?
No.
Did you have any kind of little pointy-talky things that would help you?
Well, we did it one time, but beyond that, no, I didn't carry anything.
Would it have been useful if you had known a few phrases, do you think?
Oh, sure, it would have been helpful. But one of the things I learned very quickly is that most of the Dutch people that were my age or younger spoke some English. They were, at that time in school, before they get out of high school, they were required to learn at least 2 languages. So they learned English and German. After the war started, they didn't learn German, they learned French.
Would you like some more water?
I will take it.
I think did you, are we still running?
We have 2 minutes.
Oh, goodness.
Ooh.
Maybe good time to change, actually.
We we were talking about communicating and about language and
Yeah.
so forth. Did you pick up any language along the way?
Well, in France, you begin to learn a few phrases. Even though the place that we stayed the longest in France, they did not speak any English, and so we learned a little, and we learned how to communicate. You know, the sign language works pretty well, and we did a lot of that. And then in Spain, it was more open, and probably picked up more phrases in Spain than any place.
Let's see, I think.
Getting the audio.
Okay, you're checking the volume here, and
TWA with
Okay,
Yeah,
let's-
and we got that last question.
okay, all right, so we don't need to,
No, we don't need to go over it.
okay, let's see, well, we've got you to Paris, I think. Would you pick it up there and tell us what goes on in Paris?
okay, in Paris, we got off the train and went into the subway, and got off the subway and went to a school area. This was a Catholic setup, and they owned a whole block, and they had schools, they had their church, and so forth in this. And they took us down into the basement of one of the school buildings, main building, and they generated their own electricity and so forth, and they were hiding us in a stairwell. The other four men were already there. And we had been there but a little bit, and here we hear those German boots on the in the hallway above us. And they came, and a steel door, and they were going to come in, but the door was locked. And so the janitor that was escorting them said he didn't have the key. That got us around, and the door had a sign on it, "Stay out, danger, high voltage, danger of death," so forth. Well, anyway, what they had traced a typewriter to that school that had been used in making passports, and so this is why they were in that school looking, and so they gave up at that time and left, but they knew they'd be back, and so then while they were gone, they moved us out of there across the courtyard and up into the fourth floor of part of the church building that was condemned. And that's where we spent basically 2 weeks. And we got fed once a day. Father Superior would bring it. And then one day, a young priest came in, and he looked, and he was really, really upset. And he told one of the fellows, we had a British man with us, and he spoke French. And that is a real memento. I'll hold that up for you. That's the sign that was on this door. And in English, danger of death, do not keep out. And
high voltage, do not
I finally got
danger
that.
of death.
I finally got that in 1995. That was given to me. Okay, the younger priest came in and told us that Father Superior and the janitor were being arrested, that we had to get out. And so by two, we left. And Ken Shaver asked to travel with me. And because there were 3 in his group, I was a single, and so he asked to travel with me. Next day, 4 of the 8 were arrested. 2, a pilot and his waist gunner, they got away, and they came across out of Normandy. Ken Shaver and I just kept walking straight south as far as we could, and we walked about 25 kilometers before it was dark enough we had to get off the streets. And we knocked on the door, just had to pick a door. And we knocked on the door, and the lady wasn't sure we could stay, but she said her brother stayed with her, and he would be home. And this was a Saturday evening, and he worked in Paris, and commuted to this little town near Brittany, and when he came, he decided it would be all right for us to stay all night. This lady had a son and daughter, and her husband was a French officer, and he was in a prison camp in Germany. And so the next day, they couldn't do much with us, but the next day, we knew that we were supposed to go to Toulouse. But the reason we had stayed so long, we learned later, was the group that was ahead of us, being escorted ahead of us, was infiltrated and shot up in the mountains and so forth. And so that took some reorganization, and which may have never taken place. But anyway, we were on our own. And so knowing that we wanted to go to Toulouse, the lady and two of her daughters rounded up the money, two of her friends rounded up the money, and they walked us to the train station and put us on a train for Toulouse. Here we were with a passport and couldn't speak any English, not knowing much about how to travel, but and we didn't know to watch out for the trains or where the cars might go. So we got on this one car, and the first thing you know, we went through Etamps, and the train was there a while. Here we were on another track headed out, and it went to the end of the line, stopped. Of course, by that time it was night, and we'd gotten on the wrong car. And so Ken took his ticket. We had learned to hang on to those. And he took his ticket and went up to a conductor and showed him a ticket, and the conductor said, "Stay on the train." And so it turned around and went back and pulled into a station. And when it pulled into the station, we got off. Well, we didn't dare go out through the regular station because they would have been looking for the tickets. So we went out to the edge of the railroad yard and jumped over the fence and took out in the country. And that's where we passed the big house and went to a small house, and we got help. They told us that German officers were staying in the big house. And so they kept us overnight. And then the next day they walked us back, the mister walked us back to the starting point, and we started over again. So you had lots of silly things. And I show you that we're the only ones that this family ever helped. But the young man was 17, and he later became affiliated with the 9th Air Force, later went to Vietnam with the French, and he is still living. His parents are not. But Ken went back in the early 70s and visited these people. And when he did, the lady had asked us to put our names on a slip of paper, and she rolled back the carpet and threw them underneath the carpet. And they stayed there until Ken went back. And Ken went back, and she got those slips of paper out from the carpet 30 years later or so. And then she did one other thing. She had decided that we someday would return, and so they made their own wine. And so she gave him a bottle of cherry wine that she had made in 1945. And, no, 1944. She had made this in 1944 after we'd been there. And years later when I saw her, she gave me mine. And I was confident we'd come back.
1985.
Yeah. And so anyway, we had a real problem with the train, but we got down to another town where we had to get off and start onto a different train for Toulouse. And there's one that really scared us, because we were sitting in the train station, and lo and behold, they came around checking. And it so happened in the final, because it was night and after curfew, so happened they were checking for tickets to make sure that people had tickets, not identities. But they got awfully close before we realized that. In fact, we had split up, hoping that if one of us were captured, one might get away. And so then we went out, and it was so dark we couldn't find a car that said Toulouse. So we got on another one. And that night we went into the mountains, and I didn't know which mountains we were going into, but the train was crowded, and there were no soldiers, no German soldiers. So we felt confident that we were not going to the coast, and we were not going to Germany. So we just ride it out. And we stood up most of the night. Once some young Frenchmen got up and let us have their seat for a while, we stood up for about 18 hours on that train. The next day, I'd stopped in a small mountain town, and a few people got off and some got on, and then the conductor started looking for tickets. And by that time, we realized that we were riding what was supposed to be first class. We had a third class ticket, and so that wasn't much of a thing to have. So as the train pulled out of the station, we jumped off. And we circled the station out through the fields and in about 6-8 inches of snow, found a little village and asked for some help. And these people couldn't help us, but they thought they knew someone. And that's where a young man, Rene Beffrau, came to this little village and got us late in the afternoon and took us to his house. Incidentally, he had been in the French army and been captured and escaped, and since he had escaped, he was legal to be back home. He owned a farm, had people looking after the farm and so on. Well, we spent 21 days with him and his wife. Now, there was plenty of food and plenty of wine. 21 days, and that's the only time I've ever communicated by sitting in a fireplace. The fireplace in that house was so big, it had a seat for two on each side. And so Rene and his wife, Anna, they would sit on one side, and we'd sit on the other side, and we would do some communicating. And they wanted us to stay. We thought we were being delayed. And come to find out, they were hoping that we would stay and be a member of the resistance after the invasion. And so after we finally convinced them that we didn't have the knowledge to fight that way, and so he went into town and got some communications to start us moving, and contacted the Free French. The Free French then communicated with London and verified us, and they moved us out, and we spent a few days out in the mountains. And this group of Free French, their responsibility was to maintain a drop zone. And even though we prepared 2 different times and were familiar with the drop zone, and they would announce it at 12 o'clock, and then it had to be repeated at 6 if there was going to be a drop. And in each case, it was canceled out. But then there were 2 people, a man and a woman, came out and met us there to take us into Toulouse and eventually continue our trip on to the Pyrenees.
How did you learn there was going to be a drop? Who communicated?
Well, we could communicate with these French Maquis enough to understand that, and they had a radio, and they would get certain key words over the radio of the BBC, and then that had to be repeated. That came at on 12 o'clock noon news, and then it had to be repeated at 6 o'clock.
The Frenchman you were staying with, did he speak any English?
The one where we stayed the longest time, no.
So,
well, we did get some French books out, you know, and trade a few words and so forth.
Before I lose it, we'll get you back to Toulouse in just a second. But I've got you back here behind the iron door with the sign. How many were there behind the door with you?
There were 8 of us.
Did you have anything in mind to do if the Germans had come through the door?
We would have been sitting ducks.
Did you have any weapons?
No.
Did you ever have any
I never did.
You didn't carry any weapons?
No,
with
I
you?
did not carry any weapon.
On the B-17 you didn't?
Well, I didn't.
Why not?
Well, you know, I always felt they might get you in as much trouble as they would solve problems.
Was there a policy in your unit that said you must carry or you must
No.
not carry? It was left up to
It
you?
was an optional.
Do you know any other crews who did carry weapons?
Oh, there were some men carried weapons.
Pistols or?
Pistols, yeah.
You didn't have a survival knife of any kind?
No, no.
Was there ever any discussion during your long trip there about what would happen if you had to confront the Germans, if you would have to fight?
Well, we had pretty well concluded, with Ken and I had when we were alone, that with what he had been through and no dog tags and so forth, that if we were not outnumbered, we would resist. But because he had been through it once.
Yeah. But in fact, it never came to that.
No, no.
Let's see, we've got you to Toulouse, and what happens then?
Well, as we went into Toulouse, we carried briefcases. They put us on a train from out near the drop zone, and we carried into Toulouse. We each one had 2 small suitcases. They didn't want to waste any trips. And I'm not so sure the lady that was our guide, and we still know and still living, she doubts a little bit that we had ammo and or grenades and stuff like that, but the weight tells me that we did. And they told us at the time that they had enough arms and so forth that at the time of the invasion they could take over the small towns. And I think they pretty well did. But anyhow, those were left in Toulouse. And then we stayed one night in Toulouse. The next day we got on a train and we went by Lourdes, by Pau, and then out to Saint Orleans Marie, which is further out, and that's where we got off the train. And there we were met by a car. They met us with a car and took us a few miles further out into the country, but not as far as the Forbidden Zone. And that's where we met our guide, and at a little place called Bacchus.
Could you tell us about the Forbidden Zone? What was that?
Well, of course, they initially had what was called the Free Zone, and that was pretty well north. And early in '43, when people got across the Free Zone, they were pretty much on their own. The French were pretty free. But as you got into the last of '43 and into '44, the Germans eliminated the Free Zone, and then they came to what they called the Forbidden Zone. And the Forbidden Zone, which ran along the mountains, you were forbidden to be in that zone unless you lived there. And you had to have ID and so forth that you lived there.
What would they do to you if they found you in the Forbidden Zone?
What was the punishment if you were caught in the Forbidden Zone?
Well, we would have been arrested, and whether or not we would have survived, that was another question. A lot of people did get caught and survive. Some of them that were caught down there were taken back into Paris, into Fresnes prison, and that was pretty miserable.
Did you know at the time, just before you started over the mountains, did you know that in fact only about half of the people who got that far made it? Did they give you any instruction at all about how dangerous or difficult it was going to be?
We knew it would be difficult, but thought more along the lines of the physical difficulty. But in fact, if we'd known a lot of things, they would probably may have not been so positive about what we were doing.
How large was your group when you started over? No.
That's 4 of us. Excuse me.
And it was in April?
Mid-April.
Okay. What was the weather?
of course, I'd already been behind the enemy lines for over 3 months, and when we started over, it was in the rain, and that was the first time this old Flatlander had ever been in the clouds, on the ground, and so we walked in heavy darkness, and finally we reached the point as we were getting ready to go to the swinging bridge and so forth, that it was so dark and the path was so treacherous that we hung on to each other's coattails. We couldn't see where we were going. The man closest to the guide grabbed his coattail, and that's the way it was.
Could you describe the guides?
I really couldn't describe the guide as an ordinary man. He was Basque. And a question came up sometime later, was asked of Sean Eriks, who's lived there and was the man that was with the woman that came and got me. And they said, well, how did you know you could depend on that guide? And he said, my father knew him. So his father, who lived there in the foot of the mountains, and they now have that as their home, one of their homes, his father knew this guide. And the general feeling was that, hey, he delivered or else. And these Basque guides, they were basically smugglers. And they knew those trails. And they did it back and forth. So they smuggled for money, and we were part of the cargo.
Did you have the same guide the whole way?
Yes. Once we entered the forbidden zone. Yeah, same man all the time, never turned us loose.
Did you travel all hours of the day, or?
No, we traveled, at times we traveled a little bit at certain day, but much of it was at night. And because that was, well, for example, when you were on that bridge, you could be seen for quite some distance.
Did you have any lights?
Any lights?
Was there any lighting at all?
No.
Completely in darkness.
Total darkness, and that's why the guide had to really know his way. And it so happened the last night, when we were reaching the tops, we got above the clouds, and it ended up a moonlight night. And so when we reached the border, which was the top of the mountains, the divide between France and Spain, he turned us loose, and he had to be off the mountain before daylight. And and he pointed out a sheep herder's cabin on the Spanish side where we might rest. And the Spaniard and the Frenchman, I think, went into that and rested. But we left them alone. They had different missions than we did. At that point, our objective was to get as far away from that border as we could, as fast as we could. So we started down the mountain on the Spanish side, and of course that was the south side, and the snow didn't go down so far. And then we began to see where there was little trickles of water became more, and we decided if we would continue to follow the trickles, we would eventually lead to a stream, and that's how we got down out of the mountain.
What kind of winter gear did you have on?
Oh, I had my GI shoes, I had a suit, and I had a kind of like a London fog top coat. That was it.
How cold was it?
Oh, the cold wouldn't have been so unbearable. It was cold. It was cold. And in fact, it was cold enough that when our son and grandson did it in July of 2001, they got caught in sleet and cold wind, had to go for their gloves and everything else.
You didn't suffer frostbite?
No.
What was your legal status when you got to Spain?
Well, I was immediately arrested in not the first town, but the first town the people weren't up moving that much. But when we got to the second town, we were the gendarmes were out waiting for us, and so They apparently had been tipped off from somebody. And so when they did, they put us in the little jail and waited for a bus to come. And this bus came in, and you've seen some of those buses down in Mexico and so forth, little ones and chickens on top and all. Well, boy, this was a funny deal. We had two guards, each armed, and the bus seats were all filled, and so we had to go up on top of the bus. And there were crates of chickens and eggs and so forth up there, and then there were these two guys riding shotgun looking after us. That's the way we left that little town. And we rode several miles on that setup, and then it stopped where there was going to be a crossroads, and got off, and the weather was halfway decent, and we sat on the ground and so forth and waited for a better bus to come by. And that bus came by, these two men still guarding us, and they took us into Pamplona. And by the time we got into Pamplona, it was night. But they turned us over. They took us to a hotel in downtown Pamplona, and the connections were set up there. And that's when they left us. I was kept in the town since I was an officer, and that's where I met Chuck Yeager. And then they took Ken, being a sergeant, they took him out to the edge of town. But we were kept there until we were later moved down to Saragossa and stayed in a Warm Springs hotel.
When you were arrested, what did you think was going to happen?
Well, I didn't know except that I'd be interned, and they were not abusive in any way. Now, when I got into Pamplona, and there was a military attachment in Pamplona, well, the very next day, they were there, and they took me and attempted to interrogate me. And a Spanish captain, and he spoke English, and the first thing he did, he laid a bunch of questions out, and the normal things, name, rank, serial number, your bomb group, airplane, or where your target, and all that. I went through this and just put name, rank, serial number, and stopped. And so then he attempted to interrogate me verbally. I still would give him nothing but name, rank, and serial number. Well, I guess we spent a couple of hours together, and he finally, he lost his temper a little bit, and he threw up his hand and he said, "Oh, what the hell, it's all for the Germans anyway." And by this time, I think he had begun to get smart enough to realize that the Germans were not going to win the war. But we have to expect that because Franco was indebted to the Germans. They had supplied the equipment that provided Franco to win the Civil War.
Some of the folks who made it as far as Spain were in fact turned over to the Germans.
Oh yes, early on. And in fact, early people got turned over, and they found out that the Germans were paying, and so then the Allies started paying in cash. Well, the Germans could match that, and then somebody got smart and decided the Germans couldn't match petrol. So apparently the Spanish got so many gallons of petrol for every one of us.
When you were arrested, did you think there was a possibility you might in fact be turned over to the Germans?
You know, I really didn't worry too much about that. I didn't. I felt we had a good chance of making it out.
Was there ever a time in Spain or any time, was there a time when it dawned on you, I think I'm going to make it. I believe I'm home free.
Well, I began to feel that way in Spain, particularly when I realized that after Wazera Day, they were willing to give me some different clothes, and went to a haberdashery and got a suit and got cleaned up and so on. And I realized by that point that the Allies were in control.
Now, we've got you as far as Zaragoza, what happened then?
Well, of course, that was a Warm Springs hotel, and we had a lot more liberty there, even though there was no place to go. But as long as I was in Pamplona, we had the run of the town. They had the bullfights going on and so forth there. We could not go outside the city limits. But the people were very nice to us, and
You were officers, and that made it.
yeah, the officers stayed in town. And as long as we stayed within the city limits, we were all right.
Were the enlisted people confined somehow?
Yes, they were more confined. Adequate facilities at the edge of town. And there they had an interesting thing happen. They had one man in their group that was a loner. And he kept being out by himself and so forth. And the men that were there, and there were some Frenchmen and some Canadians and Americans and so forth. And when they tried to talk with him, why he was French, but when the French tried to talk with him, it was something different. And so they kept an eye on him. And finally, they slipped up behind him one day when he was out at the fence by himself. The fellow slipped up behind him and shouted, "Octoon!" and he snapped to. Then he confessed that he had deserted on the Eastern Front. And he said that they would shoot the Russians and their tanks one day, and there were many more the next. And he had deserted, and he came out as a deserter. Well, they finally brought him out and took him on to London. But they tried different things along the line. But at Saragossa, that was a pretty nice setup, and it was just a matter of waiting.
You went from there to Gibraltar?
Well, yes, people came out from Madrid and took us from Saragossa by car.
Now, when did you with Chuck Yeager?
Well, that's where we got separated there. Oh, there was one thing with Chuck that I've always laughed about. Chuck's story as a book was great and very successful and all, but one thing in the book is a little bit different. You reading his book, the author would lead you to believe that he got shot down in a dogfight. But I can remember so well, we were all in this hotel in downtown Madrid and talking, and I asked Chuck, I said, when I found out he was a fighter pilot, I said, and what happened to you? And he said, like a damn fool, I made a second pass on an airfield. And that's really what happened to him. He got shot down making a second pass on an airfield. But, of course, and we came back and we saw Chuck after we were back in London. And he had been back to his base. Flew a mission that will never be recorded. He had out. He went for the briefing and flew a lead pilot. And the lead pilot went back and hid out in the barracks, and he flew it to see what was happening. Only his wingmen knew who was in the element lead position. And then, of course, they let him stay over. And, of course, he was a flight officer, and it was going to take a financial cut for him to become commissioned. So they made him a second lieutenant, and a few days later the orders came through and made him first lieutenant. Great fellow.
Ed Miller flew a couple of missions after he got back, too. He said, yeah, got back to England, a couple of D-Day missions, in fact. Yeah. Let's see, how did we get then from Saragossa all the way down to Gibraltar?
Okay, they came out and met us with a car and took us into Madrid. And there we were at the embassy overnight, and or for a period of time, and there was some brief interrogation there. And then they put us on a train with a guide, a person from the embassy, and we had an overnight train ride down to Gibraltar.
Why did you have to go to Gibraltar? Why?
Well, of course, that was our way out. Once we got to Gibraltar, then we were in British territory, and we crossed in.
Even though you were under the care of the American embassy in Madrid, you could not fly from Madrid.
Oh, no.
Pull your jacket
No.
across the tip.
No, No, they didn't fly into Spain. They did, of course, and that was an interesting flight out of Gibraltar.
Tell us about that.
Well, we were there 2 or 3 days, and gosh, that was an interesting place. That's just a rock with holes in it. And when we got ready to fly out, we flew out in the evening, and this was one of the things we had a man on board that was being taken out. That was the same man that the men had uncovered up in Pamplona. I don't know, but he was German. They blindfolded him before they ever put him on the plane, and it was an old DC-3. And we learned very quick that's one of those places. The airstrip is across the narrow part on the French side, on the Spanish side. You get to the end of the runway, you better be airborne or you're going to swim. And so they went out and made a big circle out into the Atlantic, and we all night kept our blinds down, and we landed the next day in I think it was probably Heathrow, and then took a train into downtown London.
If you could, just let's go ahead with the story. Tell us what happened then. You got back to London.
Well, we got back to London, of course. We went to Brook Street, which was the intelligence bureau, and we were debriefed. And I was debriefed by Captain Smith and her, and I've since met her and so on. She, and I almost had the feeling as I was debriefing her, I almost had the feeling that she knew as much about my route or more than I did. And she had been in France prior to the war and so forth, and so she knew something about some of these places. And but this was a very thorough briefing, and one of the things that was very interesting is she asked about an officer that had been with us, and I'll not say his name or anything, but he was less than appreciative of many of the things that were happening. She was aware of that.
She already knew.
And she asked questions. And of course, that's all I ever said was that I would have liked for him to have been more appreciative. But she was aware of that. The information had come back. So then, after being there a few days, the interesting thing happened there is that when we were in Spain, we had a British navigator with us. And so he came back about the same time. And in civilian life, he was on the staff at Scotland Yard. Yeah, he was an inspector at Scotland Yards, and so he said, "I'll come back and meet you on a certain night," and he said, "I'll take you to Scotland Yards to the pub and meet my friends," and he did this. And that rascal had already been back over Berlin. They were short of people. He was a navigator. And he'd already been back over Berlin. Well, of course, this was a real thrill for us, but it was a thrill for the people at Scotland Yards to have us all sit there and enjoy the evening on a beer.
When did your parents first learn that you were okay?
When I was in Spain, and in back where the embassy was aware, they were notified that I was interned in a neutral country. That's all they knew. And so it had to get home first.
Had they believed you were okay before that?
Well, yes. Yeah, once that I was interned in a neutral country, they believed I was okay.
Without mentioning names, you were on this trek quite a long time. Do you recall any kinds of behavior among Americans or other airmen, first of all, that was not helpful? What kinds of behavior were troublesome?
Well, there were at times people were not as self-disciplined as they should be. And the one person always thought they ought to be doing a little more, I guess. Hey, these people were risking their lives to help me, and I was grateful for everything they did. And I think most of the men were. Now, the Yoka tells me that one of the things that we Americans do that's a bad habit they had to break is we jingled money in our pockets. And stop that. Another thing is if you ate in a restaurant, you didn't eat with the fork in the right hand.
Did you get any of that kind of coaching while you were there?
No, I didn't happen to. I didn't have any money, and I only ate in a restaurant one time.
But no one in the underground schooled you in how to walk, how to not jangle change?
No. Now, I had done one thing. When I was in this safe house in Amsterdam, I had watched the people along the canal and so forth. I was in a downtown area, and I kind of studied that.
Okay, you taught yourself really how they walk.
Yes.
Behave.
Yes.
Okay. And you say some of the unhelpful behavior, some of the troublesome people who weren't self-disciplined enough. Can you be any more specific? What kind of how would that manifest itself?
Well, it's not what I saw, but I do know from Alpers that occasionally people left safe houses at times of the day when they shouldn't. Ended up outside playing ball if they had too many of them, and things like that.
Okay. Are you aware of any problems with alcohol?
I know there was some, but it was no problem as far as anybody that I was around and so forth. And occasionally, you heard about people in maybe the relationship too close between man and woman. None of that where I was around.
Did you get any coaching about that? Did anyone tell you leave the women alone?
No.
You mentioned there was sometimes some fighting among those going over the Pyrenees. Any more about that?
Well, what happened, for example, the group that went across before we were supposed to go across out of the Dutch-Paris line, that group had a plant, and the individual, when they stopped to rest for the night, an individual went back, and so Germans came up and they were armed and so on, and they killed several people out of that group, and the ones that survived were actually out at the edges, not into the group, and they got away.
Look at this issue the other way about kinds of behaviors that are troublesome, or what about behaviors that are helpful? Where you recall any of your fellow evaders that you looked at admiringly and said, that guy's going to make it? Things that were really helpful.
Well, when we left Paris, I knew then 4 people were arrested the next day, and I knew this one man, after Ken Shaver had asked if he could travel with me, another man from his crew asked if he could travel with me. And I said, no, Ken asked first. Well, the individual that they were wanting to separate from, he didn't have enough personal confidence. And he wanted to stay close to the British evader who spoke French. And actually, he was from Brazil, is where he was from. He was an accountant. He was back helping his country, and so in an effort to stay close, the 4 of them were captured the next day.
You say one fellow didn't seem to have enough self-confidence. Do you remember any manifestation of that?
Well, I think the biggest thing really reflected in the fact that he was hunting somebody that knew the language. And that was not, even though we didn't know it, it would have been tremendous help. That wasn't going to be the barrier for me.
Okay. About half the people who got as far as the Pyrenees made it, and about half didn't. Why do you think you made it?
Well, through all of this, I contend that the Spirit of God had a hand on my shoulder. Now, and I had shoes were important, and protecting those shoes, because the people over there couldn't find shoes for us. Plus, the fact if they did, they probably weren't big enough, and that was important in preparing. And I had prepared ahead of time. And the other thing that I constantly did, I constantly exercised wherever I could to try and stay. Again, a little extra weight. That's a bifrost, but I still exercised what I could. And so, but I think first of all was the guiding hand on my shoulder.
Was your faith important to you?
Oh, yes.
It was.
Yeah.
Was that true before you were shot down?
Yes, it had always been. And I guess I'm like a fellow I knew that flew air sea rescue for the British. He said, you know, I never did pick an atheist up out of the drink.
I wonder about your childhood. Clayton, you grew up on a farm?
I grew up on a farm.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that helped too. Yeah, I don't think the city boys had quite as good a shot at it as we farm boys did. We had to be a little more independent. We had to be a little more adventurous and so forth when we were out on our own. And that was probably pretty good training.
We've talked to several of your colleagues about it, and of course Robert Sweat grew up on a farm
Yeah.
too, and he was saying, we asked him the questions about, were you cold? Yeah. Were you hurt? Yeah. Of course, he was very seriously hurt when he got out of the plane too.
Right.
And Ed Miller and others, and we kind of get the impression that you guys were tough kids growing up. That,
Well, we're fortunate enough we grew up in the Depression. There was a certain amount of survival to that. And you didn't worry about the Joneses because they didn't have anything either. So you learned to make do with what you had. And,
did you work outdoors in the wintertime?
oh, sure, sure.
What'd you do?
Well, there were always chores to do, cows to milk and feeding and stuff like that. Also, we went out in the winter with Dad and all. We cut our wood in the snow if necessary. We harvested timber and so forth. So if it wasn't too bad, you worked out.
Having to get things done in cold, miserable weather wasn't a new thing.
No, nothing not new.
You might tell him a little bit more about why only 50% got over, because just like George Paget, he waited 5 months and was arrested as he was coming off of the train at Toulouse.
They watched, Toulouse was a town that they watched pretty heavily. So happened that my guy knew the town well enough and so forth. We went in on Sunday evening and got off before getting into the main station, apparently. They knew where to go. Some of the people, now that's one of the things I always laugh about. If Ken and I had not made a mistake, and if we'd have continued on that train to Toulouse, odds are we'd have been captured when we walked off that train in Toulouse. But somebody shoved us off at an earlier point, and it was a different thing. A lot of them were captured in that area. There were a lot of German guards around in the different parts of the Pyrenees. And as they say, some of the people physically unable got captured at different points and so on. And the longer you lingered in that area, the more chances you were of being caught.
Was there ever a time in the entire trek when you thought you might not make it?
There were always times when you wondered a little bit because you killed so much time. Things couldn't move fast enough for you, you know. And you spending 2 weeks without moving, 3 weeks without going anywhere. It kind of eats at you a little bit if you haven't developed some patience.
Could you tell us about one of those times? How did you deal with it? Yeah.
Well, the one time it was toughest was when we were with the Buffaloes, because it was really, they were taking such good care of us. It was a temptation to stay. And so we kind of had to, when people were doing so much for you.
Well, tell about the meeting he did.
Yeah, and he was in real risk. Just a few days after we left his house, he was to attend a meeting of French Underground. By luck, there was a problem on the farm, and the man that was farming came to him, and he had to help him, and he missed the meeting, and the Germans found out about the meeting, and they captured and shot up that whole group. Now, I told you that the Dutch lost 3 people for every one of us got out. Records indicate that in Belgium it was about 2 for 1. France, you're closer to the exit area, a bigger country, that ended up about 1 to 1. So the losses for our coming out were pretty high.
The toughest time of all for you, would you say it was when you were just waiting?
That was the toughest thing, was to be waiting.
I'm glad you mentioned that about the resistance too, because several people were invited to join the resistance, and
Oh, yeah.
of course, I'll leave with the Poles. They did, in fact, yeah. What was your thinking there? Why did you choose not to?
Well, first of all, we could see what they were doing, and we could see that it could be a pretty much ground fighting, and we didn't really want that. We wanted to get back, and so what we did was just finally convince them that we were not prepared. They were wanting officers. This is what they wanted. And we finally convinced them we were not trained to do that kind of thing, even though it had 2 years of ROTC and so forth. But that we were trained to fly, and that we should get back so we could fly.
You going to tell them about Claire, your helper, being
Oh.
arrested down there and tortured?
Well, just a few days after getting Kenemy down and across, her code name was Claire. Actually, it's Paula. Paula was escorting a group, and this is what happened to so many. And it so happened that she was taking a group, and they were meeting up with a guide up in the mountain area a little bit, and an individual who was part of the underground organization, a family member was captured, and in hopes of, he bargained to the Germans, and she came into this area, and there the Germans were, and they captured everybody. And they captured her, and they had her in a house. And the Germans were demanding everything of the lady at the house and so forth. They insisted that she cook them pancakes and so forth. And to this day, Claire cannot stand a pancake. But she decided that she had to get away somehow. And so what she did, she told them she had to go to the bathroom. And they let her go to the bathroom, and while she was in the bathroom, she opened the window and jumped out the bathroom window, which was some little fall. And then she took off running, ran through the briars and so forth. And they had already pretty well abused her, and she ran and ran. And in first house where she asked for some help, she looked so bad they wouldn't help her. And then finally she'd spent a night out, and then finally she went to another house, and the lady came to the door and turned her away. But then there was a call from back in the house, and an older lady back in the house said, "I don't turn people away. Let the lady in." And so she went in and told her what her story was, and she knew a contact, and they made a contact with the underground resistance people, and they came and got her. And it took some period of time before she healed enough that she could do other, and she was finally lifted out, and she went out on the same flight on the Hudson as the man that later became her husband, and they were flown to England, and in England she assisted by passing translations and so forth. She knew German real well, and that was her occupation, was actually teaching German. Of course, when France was occupied, no one wanted a German teacher, and
Talk about Barbie.
yeah, so she had many connections. She ended up with the underground because a man that stayed in her apartment building in Lyon, and then went for a meeting where Barbie came in and arrested all of them, and she didn't know whether he'd squeal. She never went home. She went out, and that's when she ended up with the underground.
Did the underground ever give you any instructions about what to do if you were captured?
No.
They didn't tell you, for instance, we've heard some places, I think it was Al Lee with the Poles, who told him that once he had joined them in the underground, that they would never let him be captured by the Germans. They would shoot him themselves before letting him be captured.
Oh, I was
Nothing like that.
nothing of that nature.
There really is a point to this. What did you major in at Kansas State?
Well, I majored in agriculture. I started out with my major being dairy production, because that was my love. Then found out I was allergic to cows, and so I switched over to manufacturing, and so I finally finished in dairy manufacturing. But one thing that helped me was to take the civilian pilot training course. And when I went to cadets, that was an interesting thing. My first instructor had 6 of us as his students, and we all had previous time. And he told us the first thing, he said, "You can all fly, you all got private pilot's license." He says, "So my job is not to find out if you can fly. My job is to find out if you can fly the Army way." And he washed one man, and that was a man that had the most hours, had 200 hours. He washed him out. And then after that, then as others dropped out, we were assigned to different instructors, and he was the check pilot for the group. That's where he went.
Clayton, you had a degree in agriculture studies, and you were offered an opportunity to be a veterinarian in the Army. Instead, you volunteered to go into flying, and a kind of flying that, 43% or more of the guys were lost supposedly early on. Why'd you do that?
Well, I just felt that's the way I was called. I felt I wanted to fly, and having had some flying, that's what I wanted to do. I never will forget. There was a little upset. I was at Billings General Hospital, but I was attached to the veterinary department over at Fort Benjamin Harrison, and then doing inspection work downtown. And when I went over and told him I was being transferred, the first lieutenant veterinarian that I reported to, he came back and he said, the colonel, the head of the department, he said, he's a little upset. He said, "I think you went over their head," which I went and took my exams, and they said they'd handle all the transfer. But he said, "Now you can fly and you can really go over his head."
You about out of time, but I've got to ask you this too. You volunteered to go into that really hazardous job of flying with B-17s. You flew three missions, I think, and shot down and
right.
took a long, torturous trek out. Would you do it again?
You know, I would do it again for exactly the same reason I did at 10. We were fighting for our freedom. And incidentally, I had three brothers. And at the time I went into service, I already had a brother in service. He missed Pearl Harbor by 3 days and ended up in Australia, and finally 30 months in India. He was a crew chief for servicing the planes on the hump. My older brother had a lot more hours. He bought time and so forth. He finally got into the Navy, a direct commission, and he instructed for a while and then ended up in transport work. And he was doing transport work in the Navy while I was missing in action. While I was missing in action, my youngest brother volunteered for the Air Force as a bombardier on B-29s and flew 25 missions over Japan. So my mother had 4 of us at one time.
Well, we're honored to be here with you. We
Well-
really are. Yeah. I think that's we've got wonderful material here.
Well,
We're very
yeah.
grateful. Yeah, we really are.
Give credit to those people who were on the ground, on the line, and walked that line that could be death with us together. They were the real heroes.